Edward Smith Miller was born December 31, 1858, on a rural farm in Danville, Boyle County, Kentucky. The son of Susan Penman and an unknown father, Miller lived his early years on the farm along with brother John and younger sister Fanny. Susan Penman was born enslaved in Danville in 1842. Her slaver was Orman Beatty, who served as president of Center College in Danville, Kentucky for over 18 years and was ruling elder in the Second Presbyterian Church. In 1868, Susan Penman, a seamstress, married Samuel Davis, who was employed as a hotel waiter. According to the 1870 U.S. Census, Miller and his siblings, identified on the census with the last name Davis, moved into the Davis household eventually, sharing the home with his younger half-sister, Lillian, the biological daughter of Samuel and Susan. In spite of her station, Susan Penman Davis was known as a brilliant and ambitious woman. Located on Alexander Drive in Danville, Kentucky, Hilldale Cemetery was one of the early local cemeteries that allowed African American burials. Outside the gates of this historic cemetery is a plaque commemorating Susan Davis's leadership in allowing African American burials and her commitment to beautifying the lot. Susan Davis founded the Danville Domestic Economy Club, an organization which encouraged voter participation and education amongst Black women in Danville. Susan Davis also had extremely high academic expectations for her children and was a voracious reader of English and Irish literature. It was said she read from Byron's Prisoner of Chillon to her grandchildren in summer during their annual visits to Danville. Susan Davis died in 1925. She and her husband Samuel rest under a common headstone in the Hilldale Cemetery. Edward S. Miller's stepfather, Samuel Davis, was also born enslaved. After the Union Army won the Battle of Perryville in the Civil War on October 8, 1862, a Union force drove Confederate forces from the county fairgrounds through Danville. In May 1864, a 6-year-old Edward Miller witnessed a group of 250 mostly enslaved males march from Danville to nearby Camp Nelson in Jessamine County. There, Colonel Andrew Clark allowed these Black men to enlist in the Union Army. Arriving with wounds inflicted upon them en route, this group was the first to enlist at this site, where over 10,000 United States colored troops trained. After fighting for the Union in the Civil War, Samuel Davis became emancipated upon his 1864 enlistment in the 114th United States Colored Troops. After the passage of the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, Samuel voted in the 1870 election. This commitment to duty and race was not lost for Edward S. Miller. The early 20th century brought profound changes to millions of Americans, and African Americans were no exception. President Rutherford B. Hayes officially ended Southern Reconstruction with the Compromise of 1877. This post-Civil War policy failed to improve race relations or provide Southern Blacks the civil rights guaranteed to them under the Constitution. Crop failures and economic downturns plagued the region. Southern Democrats' promises to protect the civil and political rights of Black people were not kept, and the end of federal interference in Southern affairs led to widespread disenfranchisement of Black voters. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans left the agrarian South for industrial cities in the North. With Reconstruction ending and the growth of lynchings, Jim Crow, and Southern state discriminatory legislation, it became clear that Edward Miller's local opportunities were limited. In 1879, a 21-year-old Edward Miller left Danville and traveled north to Meadville, Pennsylvania to take on the next chapter of his life. In Meadville, Miller continued his education while living with his uncle, the brother of Susan Penman, Russell Butler Penman. Russell B. Penman was born enslaved in 1840 in Danville, Kentucky, and left for opportunities in Meadville, Pennsylvania following the end of the Civil War. In Meadville, Penman worked for over 25 years as a local barber and civic leader. He was highly respected in the Meadville colored community. Edward S. Miller briefly worked in his uncle's barbershop while taking courses at the prestigious Allegheny College, also located in the city of Meadville. Meadville was an attractive place for Miller's migration for several reasons. The luxury of having close family living in Meadville eased his transition to the north, and Meadville, being home to the prestigious Allegheny College, had just admitted its first Black student, William C. Jason. Meadville was well known for being a haven for abolitionists during the Civil War, as it was one of the stops on the Underground Railroad. In pre-Civil War Crawford County, Pennsylvania, located less than 10 miles from Meadville, housed the farm of the great abolitionist John Brown before he relocated to Harpers Ferry, Kansas. The Pennsylvania-based John Brown also played a strategic role in the Underground Railroad, as he aided in the passing of an estimated 2,500 enslaved people safely to freedom. Edward Miller's sister, Fanny, briefly lived in Meadville and took classes at Allegheny College as well. Fanny Miller would later move back to Kentucky and graduate from Berea College, a private liberal arts work college in Berea, Kentucky. Founded in 1855, Berea College was the first college in the southern United States to be co-educational and racially integrated. Fanny Miller later married Frank Williams in 1890, whom she met at Berea. They later moved to St. Louis, Missouri, where Frank Williams was to become the first black principal of the historic Sumner High School. This union would bear 4 children. It is also known that Dr. Miller's brother, John Miller, eventually left Danville for Cincinnati, Ohio, and had a highly successful catering business. He married but had no children. A young Edward Smith Miller was just starting his educational pursuits and would soon move to Chicago to pursue his dream of becoming a medical doctor. Chicago's homeopathic and eclectic medical schools were, at this point, accepting a small contingent of African American students. In 1889, Edward S. Miller would be admitted to Chicago Homeopathic Medical College, located on the corner of Wood and York Streets, directly opposite Cook County Hospital. Using money that he earned in the Meadville barbershop and occasional assistance from his mother and stepfather back in Danville, Miller took on this Herculean task of becoming a medical doctor. Chicago Homeopathic was commissioned in 1876 for the purposes of establishing and maintaining a high-grade medical institution. The newly licensed Dr. Miller graduated with honors from this medical college in 1893. After graduation, he enrolled in the Harvey Medical College in Chicago for advanced graduate specialty training in 1896. Harvey Medical College offered night classes, allowing Dr. Edward S. Miller to work as he advanced his medical training with postgraduate courses. Dr. Edward Smith Miller had arrived, and Chicago would not be the same. However, in 1898, the nation was at a crossroad. Following the Civil War, internationally, America was testing its status as an emerging superpower. The United States only had to look off the southern coast of Florida towards Cuba to flex its newfound muscles. There was trouble in the region, and America was chomping at the bit to answer. Cuba was a Spanish colony, and Cuban natives were fighting mightily for their freedom. The Spanish-American War, spanning April 21st to August 13th, 1898, began in the aftermath of the internal explosion of USS Maine in Havana Harbor. This action led to the United States' direct intervention in the Cuban War of Independence. In 1898, Dr. Miller was considered an ambitious and amicable physician who was enjoying the start of a large and lucrative practice in Chicago. However, proving to America that a black man was as capable as any other man, combined with his commitment to country, propelled his enlistment into the 8th Illinois Volunteer Infantry. When the United States declared war against Spain in the spring of 1898, it was a common belief among the white political and military establishment that Negro soldiers were not capable of being commanded by Negro officers. The 8th Illinois Voluntary Infantry was one of a few regiments that consisted of all Negro soldiers and officers. Edward Miller proudly answered his call of duty, joining the 8th Illinois, and was commissioned as a first lieutenant and assistant field surgeon. Upon all occasions, in every emergency, and in every cause wherein the love of the Union, liberty, and freedom was involved, the black soldier has always been the first of his countrymen to respond to his country's call and answer yes. Corporal W.T. Good, Company F, 8th Illinois Volunteer Regiment. The 8th Illinois Volunteer Infantry was organized and mustered into the service of the United States at Springfield, Illinois, July 12th to 21st, 1898, with 43 officers and 1,226 enlisted men. On July 13th, 1898, at Camp Tanner, Springfield, Illinois, 1,300 black soldiers under the command of black men held up their right hands and avowed loyalty and allegiance to a country that had not always been loyal to them. But unlike the other white regiments in Illinois, the Illinois 8th Volunteer Infantry was not immediately called to deployment to Cuba as originally promised by then Illinois Governor John Riley Tanner. Tanner and military leadership were still not convinced that an all-black regiment with black command was prepared to fight in Cuba. Even after being called to Springfield Camp Tanner, they were still not called to be deployed. Miller and his fellow soldiers in the 8th Illinois Volunteer Infantry were heartbroken. When was it ever going to be their chance to prove that they were equal to the immediate task and in the eyes of God? But a new development was happening. The all-white 1st Illinois Regiment, called the Dandy 1st of Chicago, had been deployed in Cuba for several months and were melting away before the onslaught of the terrible Cuban fevers in the trenches around San Diego, Cuba. Drenching daily tropical rains had transformed their camp streets into rushing streams. Constant exposure and insufficient food supply had changed almost every tent into a sick room. The 1st Illinois was suffering. The dead march was more often heard than the mess call. Death was staring every man in the face, and every man in the regiment realized it. They were desperate for help, and the 8th Illinois Volunteer was quick to answer the call. Springfield, August 4th, 1898. The following note was sent to Washington. I called the officers of the 8th Illinois, colored, in conference, and they are unanimously and enthusiastically in favor of being sent to relieve the 1st Illinois at Santiago. H.C. Corbin, Adjutant General. The very next day, the Adjutant General sent this answer. The Secretary of War appreciates very much the offer of the 8th Illinois Volunteer Infantry for duty in Santiago, and has directed that the regiment be sent there by the steamer Yale, leaving New York next Tuesday. H.C. Corbin, Adjutant General. Despite tremendous amounts of racism already being cast upon them, finally, on August 4th, the 8th Illinois Voluntary was dispatched to Cuba to relieve the 1st Illinois White Battalion in Santiago. This message was sent with the full understanding that the 8th Illinois was volunteering to be sent into the exact spot where the white 1st Illinois was dying en masse. This, however, was not a deterrent to this determined regiment. Miller and his comrades left Springfield and headed to New York to be transported to Cuba on the steamship Yale on August 11th. They arrived in Santiago, Cuba on August 16th. Their trip was rough and they slept on the open deck and had little food or water on the transport. When the 8th Illinois Volunteer Regiment left for Cuba, the African-American soldiers in the Volunteer Army viewed their mission as sacred. If they proved their patriotism and manhood in Cuba, they could win both civil rights and respect at home. Finally, after spotting Morro Castle and the Bay of Guantanamo, filled with American warships, Miller and the 8th Illinois Volunteers knew that the time was now. Eventually, despite a very late arrival to Cuba, the 8th Illinois Volunteer Infantry, under the command of Colonel John Marshall, were successful in their mission. Upon inspection, the commanding general found the city of St. Louis, that the 8th Illinois Volunteer were responsible for securing, as well as the camp in safe and good sanitary condition. The experiment was a rousing success. Black soldiers could be commanded by black officers just as well as they could be commanded by white officers. Also, black officers were independently more capable of carrying out military missions successfully. The post hospital at St. Louis, which was established for the reception of sick white soldiers from the 23rd Kansas and the 1st Illinois, consisted of several large buildings erected by the Spaniards. This hospital was directly under the charge of Major Allen A. Wesley. A corps of more than 40 well-trained men looked after the patients and administered the medicines prescribed by the surgeons. At the outdoor camp's field hospital, Lieutenant and Assistant Surgeon Edward S. Miller oversaw the entire field hospital camp operations, in which over 300 men were treated daily. It was said that Miller was held in high esteem by all of the officers of his regiment, and every private spoke good words of him and his skills as a doctor and an officer. At the end of the stay of the 8th Illinois Volunteer, U.S. President William McKinley said that his decision to allow the 8th Volunteer Infantry to relieve the fever-stricken Illinois 1st was one of the proudest moments in his life. The end of the Spanish-American War coincided with the armistice negotiations with Spain conducted in Washington, and the war officially ended with the signing of a protocol on August 12, 1898. Besides ending hostilities, this agreement pledged Spain to surrender all authority over Cuba. The war over now, the 8th Illinois Volunteers sailed home on the steamship Chester on March 10, 1899. On March 16th, the boat dropped anchor at Newport News, Virginia. Dr. Edward Miller and his fellow soldiers then traveled by train through Virginia, Kentucky, and Indiana, finally arriving in Chicago on March 18, 1898. They received a magnificent ovation upon their return along the line of parade down Michigan Avenue, complete with a glorious banquet and huge reception. This cultural experiment was a rousing success, as once again blacks proved more than equal in every way. Lost in all the excitement of leaving Springfield, Illinois for Cuba, Dr. Miller married his betrothed, Mary Mamie Evans of Winchester, Kentucky. The 30-year-old Evans had traveled to Camp Tanner in Springfield, Illinois, and married Edward Miller on the eve of his dispatch to Cuba. Miller was finally home, a conquering hero. With his new wife, it was time for his next chapter. Edward S. Miller had only begun to set his footprints on the city of Chicago. Bordered on the north by East 31st Street and the south by East 51st Street, Chicago's Bronzeville sits prominently east of South Cottage Grove Avenue and west of South LaSalle on Chicago's south side. Bronzeville was the hub of the Chicago Black Renaissance. An influx of Black-owned businesses, theaters, nightclubs, and dance halls lined the streets. If you were it in the African-American community during the turn of the century in Chicago, you lived and worked in Bronzeville. This neighborhood was home to or served as the launching pad for numerous notable African Americans, including Gwendolyn Brooks, Louis Armstrong, Muddy Waters, Ida B. Wells, Lorraine Hansberry, and Bessie Coleman, among others. Because of the contributions of these people, present-day Bronzeville, also known as the Black Metropolis, is one of the nation's most significant landmarks of African American urban history. Edward S. Miller was definitely it. Miller began his medical career opening his office at 3101 South State Street, directly in the center of this cultural metamorphosis. Miller and his wife Mary lived in the heart of Bronzeville in a luxurious home located at 3624 South Wabash.